In this video, we will cover Chapter 5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More specifically, we will cover these 3 tutorials which explain how to use JSON Property Annotation to map DTO properties or DTO setters or input parameters into DTO constructor with JSON properties if those have different names. So let's start by showing how to use JSON property annotation to annotate DTO properties. So this is how our DTO will look like. So we have a DTO that only has 2 properties, name and age. And we have a JSON string which also has 2 properties, but they have different names, first name and age with capital A. So in order to tell Spring Framework which JSON property should be loaded into which DTO property, since these properties don't have the same name, we need to use JSON Property Annotation to define that mapping. So with this JSON Property Annotation, which applies to this DTO property, we are telling Spring Framework that JSON Property first name should be loaded into DTO property name. And this second line says that the JSON property age should be loaded into DTO property age. This is how our controller will look like. It will have an endpoint which takes DTO as its own single parameter, and then these DTO properties will be properly filled with JSON properties by using mapping defined with the JSON property annotations as just described. Now, when we start our application, we can use Postman to send post requests to our endpoint with this JSON string inside the request body. And we will get this response from our endpoint as defined by this line, which uses DTO properties, which were automatically populated by JSON properties by using JSON property annotation to properly map between DTO properties and JSON properties. We will now show how to use JSON property annotation with DTO setters. In this example, our person DTO will also have these additional setters besides the needed properties. And each setter can be then annotated using JSON property annotation in exactly the same way as we have been annotating our properties in the previous example. We need these JSON property annotations because our setters have different names from the JSON properties which should be used to call these setters. So here we have a JSON property first name, but we want the value of this JSON property to be input parameter into this setter which has a different name. So by using JSON property annotation, we are telling Spring Framework that this JSON property should be with this name should be mapped to a setter with this name. And with this JSON property annotation, we are telling Spring Framework that this JSON property should be mapped to this setter. Then the values of these properties will be used as input parameters into the setters, and then inside the setters we can use these values to actually set our properties of our DTO. Our controller our endpoint will look the same as in the previous example. It will have this DTO as the only parameter, and then it will output the values of these DTO properties. We can test this example by using Postman and calling our endpoint URL and then sending this JSON string inside the body of the HTTP request. Our controller, our endpoint, will then return this string, which was constructed by using values from the DTO, which was input parameter into the endpoint. And lastly, we will show how to use JSON property annotation to annotate input parameters into the DTO constructor. So here we have a DTO, and inside it we have defined a single constructor which now has two input parameters, one for each of the properties that needs to be set. Since these input parameters again have different names than the JSON properties, we need to use JSON property annotation in this form to map DTO properties with JSON properties. So this line says that input parameter into constructor name should be mapped to JSON property first name, so that the value of JSON property should end inside this input parameter. And the same it applies to this second parameter. Then inside the constructor we are actually setting the values to our DTO properties. Our controller again looks exactly the same as in previous two examples, where endpoint uses DTO as its only input parameter and then returns this string, which is constructed by using values from DTO properties. This example can be tested using Postman by sending a post HTTP request to this endpoint's URL, and inside the body we can add this JSON string as shown here. Our endpoint will then return this string, which is constructed by the values from DTO properties, which were populated from JSON string properties by using mappings defined by JSON property annotations, which were added to the input parameters of the constructor, DTO constructor. So now we have shown how to use JSON property annotation to populate DTO properties, setters, or constructor parameter with JSON properties in case JSON properties have different names than DTO properties or DTO setters or DTO input parameters into the constructor.